Imagine this. You're sitting across from someone you love. They're not yelling. They're not demanding. In fact, they're smiling soft, familiar, disarming. You nod along. You agree, even though something inside you doesn't. You silence your instinct. You filter your truth. And for a moment, everything feels peaceful. But then hours later, maybe days, you feel it. A quiet, invisible weight pressing on your chest. A subtle betrayal, not of them, but of yourself. And you wonder, why do I always leave parts of myself behind just to be accepted? This is how control begins. Not with chains, but with expectation. Not with violence, but with validation. Not with domination, but with attachment. You weren't forced to obey. You chose it, or at least, that's what it felt like. But Carl Jung would have told you something much darker. You were never really choosing. Not freely, not consciously. You were playing out a script one written by fear, by early wounds, by unconscious patterns that masquerade as personality. Because control, the most dangerous kind, doesn't look like control at all. It looks like pleasing your parents. It looks like keeping the peace in your relationship. It looks like being agreeable at work. It looks like being the good one, the selfless one, the strong one. And slowly, without a single command being given, you forget who you are, because you've become what they needed you to be. Carl Jung knew this well. He didn't speak of freedom as mere political liberty or social rebellion. He spoke of a deeper, more urgent kind of freedom, psychic freedom, the ability to live from the core of your being, not from the roles you've inherited or the expectations you've absorbed. But here's the paradox. You can be kind, successful, and well-liked and still be completely controlled by your fears, by your past, by the unspoken rules in the air around you. So what if you then never actually met your real self only, the version of you built for approval? What if the reason you keep feeling drained, conflicted, or resentful isn't because others are demanding too much, but because you've forgotten how to say no? You smile when you're tired. You agree when you're unsure. You apologize for things you didn't do. And deep down, a quiet voice whispers, "This isn't me." But still, you obey out of habit, out of fear, out of the deep and ancient belief that love must be earned through surrender. And this is where the control tightens, not externally, but internally. Because now, you've become your own captor. The cage is in your mind, the bars are built from shoulds, and the warden wears your face. So ask yourself, when was the last time you made a decision without factoring in how someone else would feel? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be misunderstood rather than bending to be accepted? When was the last time you told the truth, not the diplomatic truth, not the gentle truth, the whole truth? And what would happen if you started? Would people leave? Would they punish you? Would they say, "You've changed"? Or more terrifying still, what if no one noticed at all? What if the version of you re-protecting is invisible because it was never real to begin with? This is the existential tension Jung devoted his life to confronting. The war between the persona, the mask we wear to survive, and the self, the vast, unknowable force we were born to become. To reclaim your life, you must walk into that battlefield, not with violence, but with vision, not with rebellion for rebellion's sake, but with a sacred vow. Never again will I abandon myself for the comfort of others. But to make that vow, you must first understand what's really controlling you and why. Because if the prison is internal, then so is the key. But first, you have to see the prison. You have to name the invisible forces. You have to confront the part of you that chose survival over sovereignty. This is where it begins, not with external enemies, but with the silent psychological contracts you've signed without ever reading them. The next step is not simple. It is not clean, but it is necessary. Let's go deeper. Let's ask the terrifying question Jung left us with. What parts of yourself did you give away in exchange for belonging? And what would it take to get them back? Control is rarely something we notice when it's happening. That's what makes it so devastating. You imagine control looks like dominance, coercion, manipulation. But Jung's work reveals something far more unsettling. The deepest control doesn't come from others. It comes from within, installed early, silently, and with your full cooperation. From your earliest moments, you learned. Approval equals survival. As a child, when you cried too loud, someone punished you. When you showed too much anger, someone withdrew. When you asked hard questions, you were redirected, shamed, or ignored. So what did you do? You adapted. You buried the fire. You disguised the questions as politeness. You repackaged your raw truth as something more tolerable. And somewhere along the way, the real you, the wild, intuitive, unfiltered self, was folded up and stored away. But the persona? That was praised. That was rewarded. Carl Jung understood the persona as a social necessity, a mask that allows us to function in civilization. But when you forget it's a mask, when you start believing it is you become imprisoned by it. You confuse conformity with morality. You call your fear of confrontation compassion. You call your silence maturity. But beneath it all is a single psychological contract you didn't realize you signed. If I become who they need me to be, I will be loved. If I disobey, I will be abandoned. And that fear of abandonment, of rejection, of existential exile is the most powerful form of control the psyche can endure. It drives everything. Your choices, your relationships, your self-worth. You think you're making decisions. You're not. You're reacting to invisible chains. Now step back and imagine this in broader terms. A society built on personas, not people. A culture that conditions us to be liked more than to be whole. From school to family to media, you're not taught to be conscious, you're taught to be compliant. To color within the lines, to speak without offense, to succeed without questioning who defined success in the first place. This is where thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre enter the conversation. Nietzsche warned of the herd morality, a collective ethic that demands sameness under the guise of goodness. Sartre, in his existential writings, exposed the human tendency toward bad faith, the habit of lying to ourselves to avoid the burden of true freedom. And what is freedom, really? It is not the absence of rules. It is the absence of internal compulsion. The ability to choose without being secretly governed by fear, guilt, or the desperate need to belong. Arthur Schopenhauer saw it clearly. Most people are not free. They are bound by what he called the will, a blind force of survival, instinct, an inherited impulse. Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps, took it further. Man is not destroyed by suffering, he wrote, but by meaninglessness. And so long as your meaning is borrowed from parents, partners, society, you are not truly alive. You are only performing. Jung's own framework brings these ideas home with brutal honesty. Every person, he said, must confront the shadow, the repressed, often dark side of the psyche that contains all the parts you are taught to deny. And here's the twist. If you don't face your shadow, you project it. You become controlled not just by others, but by the disowned parts of yourself. You call people manipulative, but you're afraid to say no. You call them narcissistic, but secretly crave their validation. You fear their judgment, but have never stopped judging yourself. Control is not always inflicted. Often it's invited, because it's familiar, because it feels like home, because your nervous system has associated discomfort with safety and self-erasure with love. And the more you fear being alone, the more you submit. You give your time, your energy, your truth to jobs, relationships, ideologies that no longer fit. And they smile, thank you, reward you for being so easy to work with, so emotionally mature. But Carl Jung would ask, at what cost? Because if you're never uncomfortable, never questioned, never challenged, chances are you're not free. You're compliant. And compliance, Jung would argue, is the enemy of individuation, the process of becoming your full, autonomous self. And that's the hidden tragedy. Most people don't need to be imprisoned. They've already internalized the jailer. Most control isn't external, it's inherited, passed down like a family heirloom. The rules may have changed, but the operating system remains the same. Stay small, stay likable, stay safe. But safety is not peace, and likability is not love, and politeness is not integrity. So the real question becomes, who are you when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when no one is shaping you, when no one is handing you a script? Have you ever met that version of yourself? Do they even exist anymore? Or have they been buried under decades of adaptation? The journey to freedom does not begin with rebellion. It begins with recognition. A radical act of seeing through the patterns, the roles, the voices in your head that don't belong to you. But once you see them, you can never unsee them. And that is where the real consequences begin, not in society, but in the soul. Because once you begin to awaken, you no longer fit the mold. You become dissonant. And that's where we must go next. Because this isn't just personal, it's epidemic. And the price of staying asleep is far greater than you think. You don't notice it right away. No one does. The loss doesn't come with a siren or a breakdown. It comes quietly, through small decisions you barely register. You hold back a truth to avoid conflict. You accept a job that dulls your spirit, that pays the bills. You stay silent when something inside you is screaming. And over time, these small acts of self-abandonment pile up like dust in a room you've stopped entering. Then one day you look in the mirror, and there's a strange blankness in your eyes. You're functioning. You're present. You're even fine. But something vital is missing, and you can't quite name what it is. Carl Jung could. He would tell you, the self has been exiled. The center of your being, the core of your instincts, values, and voice, has been drowned in a sea of adaptation. And now, without even knowing it, you're haunted by the consequences of a life lived under invisible control. What does that haunting look like? It looks like chronic anxiety that you mistake for ambition. It looks like resentment in your relationships that simmers under every smile. It looks like a deep fatigue that sleep never seems to fix. It looks like success that feels hollow, achievement that feels like a performance, love that feels like duty. It looks like a life filled with people, yet an unbearable loneliness in your chest. Because when you've shaped your identity around being acceptable to others, you've created a version of yourself that cannot hold your soul. Psychologically, this is what Jung called living from the persona instead of the self. Neurologically, you're in a constant state of low-grade threat. Your nervous system has learned to anticipate the moods, needs, and judgments of others as a matter of survival. You become hyper-aware, hyper-available, hyper-responsible for everything except your own inner world. This is the cost of long-term control. You lose the ability to hear yourself, and the silence is not peaceful. It's disorienting. In the absence of a true inner compass, you begin to look outward for direction. You crave feedback, praise, reassurance. You become dependent on others to regulate your emotions, confirm your decisions, validate your worth. This is not connection. This is psychological dependency disguised as emotional intimacy, and society rewards it. It tells you to be agreeable, to work harder, to be grateful, to not make a fuss, to smile, especially if you're suffering, especially if something feels deeply wrong, especially if you're dying inside, because a well-adjusted, quiet, self-sacrificing person is easier to manage than someone who has reclaimed their fire. And here's where the trap tightens. The longer you remain in this state, the more your internal boundaries erode. You no longer know where you end, and others begin. You don't recognize manipulation when it's masked as love. You don't see abuse when it comes in soft tones and careful logic. You tolerate emotional violations because they don't look like violations. You might even find yourself defending the people who are quietly destroying you. Why? Because they reflect the system you've internalized. If I stay small, I will stay loved. And so you shrink. You contort. You rationalize. You justify. Until one day, the pain becomes unbearable, not because someone hurt you, but because you've been hurting yourself to avoid being alone. This is the moment of crisis Jung spoke of, the point where the psyche can no longer tolerate the mask, where the soul begins to rebel against the persona, where symptoms, depression, anxiety, apathy, rage no longer feel like problems, but messages. Signals from within saying, "Come back. Find me." Jung didn't pathologize these breakdowns. He honored them. He believed that the psyche will destroy the false self, if it must, because wholeness is more essential than comfort. But until that moment comes, most of us drift, not in agony, but in numbness. We read books on self-help that never really land. We watch videos on boundaries and healing, but struggle to implement them. We talk about awakening, but remain asleep, because we don't realize how deeply we've been programmed to obey, not by tyrants, but by the people we love, not through punishment, but through reward, not with violence, but with silence. And here is the most chilling art. The world doesn't want you to wake up. Not your workplace, not your social circle, maybe not even your family, because a conscious, self-directed individual threatens every system built on unconscious agreement. You will be called difficult. You will be told you've changed. You will be blamed for disrupting the emotional economy. But that disruption is necessary. It's sacred. It's what happens when a soul begins to remember itself. This is why the consequences of control are not just psychological, they're spiritual. Because when you live inauthentically for too long, your life starts to feel like a lie. Not just externally, but existentially. You begin to feel like a ghost in your own body, a spectator in your own story. And that ache, that unbearable disconnection from your own essence, I sin, something you can fix with routine or affirmation or willpower. You must burn down the structure that made it possible. That's where we're going next. To the moment everything changes. To the rebellion your soul has been quietly preparing for. Because once you see the cost of staying asleep, you will do anything to wake up, even if it means becoming the version of you others were afraid you'd become. Especially if it means that. It starts with a pause. Not a scream, not a declaration, not some dramatic exit. Just a breath, a long, deliberate breath that disrupts the rhythm you've been following for years. The rhythm of pleasing, of nodding, of bending, of performing. And in that pause, something ancient stirs. A whisper rises not loud, but undeniable. It says, "No more." You don't even know what "no more" means yet, but your body does. Your nervous system, so used to contorting for safety, flinches at the thought. Your mind, trained to anticipate everyone else's emotions before your own panics. And still, the whisper remains. No more. This is the first act of rebellion. Not defiance, but presence. The willingness to stop running. To stop obeying. To stop apologizing for your existence. Carl Jung believed true healing doesn't come from becoming better. It comes from becoming whole. And wholeness demands that every exiled part of you return. Not just the kind parts. Not just the polite, functional, generous ones, but the wild parts, the angry parts, the unfiltered parts, the ones you buried because someone somewhere told you they were too much. To become whole, you must break the unconscious pact you made with control. You must violate the internal rules that kept you lovable, You must betray the script. And yes, it will feel like betrayal. Because for so long, you equated self-betrayal with connection. You equated silence with safety. You equated being needed with being wanted. But here is the truth that no one ever told you. You don't need to be needed to be worthy. You don't need to be useful to be loved. You don't need to be soft to be safe. So the rebellion begins with boundaries. Not just with others, but with your own conditioning. You stop over-explaining. You stop rushing in to fix everyone's discomfort. You stop twisting your words so people won't misunderstand you. You stop saying yes when your body screams no. And when the guilt rises, because it will, you sit with it. You don't collapse. You don't chase. You don't negotiate your truth for temporary relief. You simply watch the guilt burn. This is the fire Jung spoke of, the psychic transformation that comes not from suppressing the shadow, but from integrating it. You don't heal by becoming more agreeable. You heal by becoming real. And realness has a cost. People will leave. You will be misunderstood. Some relationships will crumble because they were built on a version of you that no longer exists. Let them fall. You are not here to be preserved. You are here to evolve. You are not here to play a role. You are here to remember yourself. And remembering is not the gentle act. It's a revolution. You start reclaiming the parts of yourself that were labeled dangerous. Your voice, your instinct, your anger, your power. You recognize that your too much was always someone else's threshold, not your truth. And once you begin this reclamation, something remarkable happens. Your reality starts to reorganize. You begin attracting people who aren't interested in your mask. They want your truth. You start feeling discomfort, not from being disliked, but from pretending. You find peace not in avoiding conflict, but in surviving it with your integrity intact. And slowly, you realize that the world you feared, the world that might reject you, judge you, exile you, is far less terrifying than the world you built to survive in. The cage was never external. It was always internal. And now you're dismantling it one breath, one boundary, one brutal act of honesty at a time. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." You were resisting your shadow, your truth, your depth, your pain, and in doing so, you gave it control. But now, you are turning toward it. You are integrating what you once disowned. And this is the real revolution, not becoming someone new, but returning to who you were before the world taught you to be afraid of yourself. You were never meant to be docile. You were never meant to be endlessly forgiving. You were never meant to be molded by the emotional needs of others. You were meant to be sovereign, to live by your inner truth, even when it shakes the room, to speak when your voice trembles, to walk away when staying means abandoning yourself. And this rebellion, it's not a phase. It's not a dramatic storyline. It's a homecoming, a reckoning, a sacred disobedience against the lie that said you had to earn your worth by erasing your soul. You're not here to be palatable. You're here to be free. And now you are. But there's one final realization still waiting. One truth deeper than all the others. One insight so piercing, so final, it shatters the illusion at its root. Because even after all this, after the rebellion, the boundaries, the awakening, there is still a lingering fear. The fear that maybe, just maybe, you'll fall back into the old patterns. That someone, someday, will reach inside and take your power again. But Jung left us one final lesson. And when you understand it, something irreversible happens. You realize you were never under their control to begin with. And that changes everything. It hits you not like thunder, but like silence. After all the fire, after all the breaking, after all the rebellion, you arrive at something so still, so quiet, it almost feels like nothing at first. But it isn't nothing. It's the absence of noise, the absence of lies, the absence of the 1,000 invisible strings that once pulled at your every move. And into that stillness, a truth emerges. One so simple, so pure, so absolute, it feels like standing in the middle of your own life for the first time. They never had control. You gave it to them, not because you were weak, not because you were broken, but because, at some deep level, you believed you had no other choice. You believed love required obedience. You believed belonging required performance. You believed safety came from silence. But now, standing in the ashes of who you used to be, you see the truth. Every moment of control was, at its core, a moment of unconscious agreement. Jung's final lesson is not about fighting for control. It is about ending the illusion that anyone else ever truly held it. Control only works on those who believe they must be controlled. Authority only dominates those who cannot access their own. You see it now. You were never truly trapped. You were entangled in a story passed down through generations, a story whispered in schools, enforced in families, praised in religions, codified in laws, a story that told you who you were allowed to be, a story that said, shrink, obey, smile, endure. And the most devastating part? You believed it. You didn't just play the role, you became it. You forgot it was a costume. You forgot there was anything beneath it. You forgot you had a name before they gave you one. But now you remember. And here is the ultimate truth. Freedom is not something you win. It's something you reclaim. Not from the outside world, but from your own conditioned mind. From the voice in your head that echoes a parent's disapproval. From the impulse to explain yourself. From the guilt that rises when you choose yourself. That guilt? That ache in your chest when you speak up? That's not your conscience. That's your conditioning. And when you see it, truly see it, it dies. Not with a scream, but with a whimper. Because it cannot survive the light of your awareness. You are not the frightened child anymore. You are not the obedient one. You are not the character they needed you to play. You are something far more dangerous to the systems that raised you. You are awake. And now, there is no going back. You look around and see the world not as it was sold to you, but as it is. A stage, a theater of projection, a mirror maze of unresolved wounds and unconscious roles. But now you walk differently. You choose differently. You no longer play along to stay safe. Because safety without sovereignty is just a prettier word for submission. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And he was right. Because when you accept yourself completely, your rage, your grief, your passion, your boundaries, your solitude, you can no longer be controlled. You become untouchable in the deepest sense. Not because you're hard, not because you're armored, but because there is nothing left in you that's for sale. You don't need to be liked. You don't need to be chosen. You don't need to be anything but true. And this terrifies the world. Because people who are no longer controlled cannot be predicted. They cannot be marketed to. They cannot be manipulated. They cannot be seduced into roles that betray their soul. They are free not in theory, but in embodiment. And so are you. So now the question changes. It's no longer, how do I stop being controlled? That question is obsolete. Now the question is this. What will you build with your freedom? Because freedom isn't the end. It's the beginning. It's the blank canvas. The cleared stage. The first breath after the storm. Will you write? Will you leave? Will you say the thing you've always been too afraid to say? Will you finally live as if you belong to no one but yourself? Because that is where the soul begins to sing. That is where your real life begins. Not in obedience. Not in rebellion, but in presence with who you really are. There's no applause here. No trophy. No perfect moment. There's just you. Your voice. Your knowing. Your breath. And a single sentence that now lives in your bones. You'll never be controlled again. Because now you remember, you never truly were. If this awakens something in you, subscribe now. Your transformation has only just begun.